We just finished it, so ProQuest is getting it ready to go up online. It'll be amazing. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here with Jeremy and with Mel. For those of you who've not yet had the opportunity, I just want to recommend very strongly. We were saying out in the hallway a couple of things. One is that Henry Kissinger is the gift that keeps on giving to historians and policy analysts. He created the best documented set of foreign policy decisions and events of probably any national security advisor or secretary of state, between the telephone transcripts and the memoranda of conversations. In fact, the multiple versions of each of those, which they created for multiple audiences and multiple purposes, gives us a lot to work with. To Jeremy's enormous credit, and he says this in the book, he did not submerge himself, drown himself in this detail, but actually tried to find more deeper motivations, deeper roots of Kissinger's thinking, Kissinger's decisions. It's a fascinating book as a psychological profile. I have much to argue with in there on the descriptions of specific policy initiatives, but we'll get to that later. We're going to start with Jeremy just to talk for about 20 minutes about his reasons for doing the book, what he tried to accomplish, and then we'll have Mel Leffler, our distinguished friend from University of Virginia and a familiar face to everyone here at the Wilson Center and a guru to all of us in Cold War studies. And he's blushing already. And Mel will then tell us all and tell Jeremy whether or not Jeremy actually succeeded in doing what he set out to do. And so let's have Jeremy go first, and then I would like to open it up after Mel to questions and comments. Thanks.
Great, and I'll talk for about 20 minutes as Tom has ordered me, just so we can have a lot of discussion here. I want to begin by thanking Tim McDonnell and Christian Osterman, who put this together and who do a fantastic job here. I want to thank Mel Leffler and Tom Blanton for coming, and Mel in particular for being really a mentor of sorts for many, many years. And John Cooper, my colleague, who's in the back there, who actually hired me at the University of Wisconsin years ago. So I have a lot to thank John for. Writing this book and talking about this book has really been a great pleasure for me, though it's also kept me up at night in many ways, trying to keep up with the documents, but also trying to deal with the issues that I really tried to deal with in the book, issues that really motivated why I wrote the book, and issues that are, in a sense, irresolvable, but issues that I think we need to discuss as historians and as policymakers and observers of policymakers. The two overriding questions for the book, for me, were these. First, why is it that someone with Kissinger's background and Kissinger's extraordinary skill and competence could produce so many mixed results? Why is that? And those of you who have looked at the book or looked at the reviews know that I begin sort of by laying my cards on the table. I'm deeply dissatisfied with presumptions that bad outcomes necessarily mean a bad person. I think that's the easy kind of history to write. Why is it that good people, or at least reasonable people, and I think Kissinger is a reasonable person, and I'll explain why in a few minutes, people with reasonable, thoughtful ideas on the world produce mixed outcomes, particularly mixed outcomes with the high moral valence of the outcomes in Kissinger's period. And second, even more deeply than that, my book is an attempt to understand how policy is made by a confluence of factors beyond the traditional issues that are brought up when studying policy. I'm deeply influenced and deeply concerned with the role that balance of power considerations, national interest considerations, and standard diplomacy make for policy making. But I'm also interested in the ways in which culture and ideas intersect with those. And to lay my cards on the table again, I'm deeply dissatisfied with work that chooses one or the other approach. There's a lot of work on culture and foreign policy today, much of which is about culture and not much about foreign policy at all, in fact. And my book is really an effort to show how the two come together. And so in both of these cases, why do good men do bad things, and how do cultures and ideas influence policymaking, Kissinger is, in a sense, an extended case study for me. And my argument in the book, if there's one overriding argument, is that Kissinger's policies reflect, of course, his personal failings and foibles, as the policies of any individual do, but more deeply, they reflect a series of changes, transformations within American society, transformations that reflect the experience of World War II and the institution and networks that were formed thereafter. That there is a side to the Cold War we have not fully understood, because we have not sufficiently connected the domestic transformations of the post-war period to the international transformations that were interrelated to them. And so my work is an attempt to see that, and not to let Kissinger off the hook. I'll make my standard caveat and preemptive response already. I am not saying that one should apologize for what he did, but I also am deeply dissatisfied with attempts to accuse him of being a war criminal, because I think that, in a sense, separates him out from the circumstances in which he came of age. My book is an attempt to contextualize his career, then a standard historical effort to contextualize Kissinger's career. Let me highlight three of the real areas of analysis in the book, among many, but areas of analysis that I think capture much of the research and many of the arguments that I wanted to make in the book. And the three will follow these lines. I'll talk a little bit about Kissinger's early years and his transatlantic background and his transatlantic view of international politics, which I think is crucial. Then I'll talk a little bit about knowledge and policy and the role that intellectuals come to make in policymaking, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And then I'll talk a little bit about the legacies, what the book ends on, and how the history of Kissinger's policy is our contemporary policy in places like Iraq as well. So let me begin quickly by focusing a little bit on the transatlantic issues. Writing this book, I became more and more convinced of something that Mel knew long before, and Wojtek and others knew long before I wrote this book, how important World War II is. There's a way in which I think my generation of Cold War historians tended to start our studies of the Cold War after World War II, and that was a mistake. I've come to believe, working on Kissinger, that we cannot overstate the importance of World War II, not so much in terms of what it meant for a quote-unquote greatest generation, but for what it meant for the intellectual architecture that individuals brought to policymaking, and for the ways in which the nature of policy, the institutions, the people, the ideas, and the networks shifted. And the most significant shift that I highlight in my book, a shift that I think historians have not paid enough attention to, is the arrival and integration, or at least partial integration, of Jewish refugees into American policymaking. There is a cross between the history of Jews in America and the making of American Cold War foreign policy at the end of World War II, in that transitional period, that's absolutely crucial. Kissinger comes, as most of you know, to the United States in 1938, fleeing the intolerance and anti-Semitism of Germany. He comes from a town called Fürth, just outside of Nuremberg. And it was a town where his family was respected, but not fully integrated in any sense. It was also a town where his father was a respected Gymnasiumlehrer, which in German is much more than a high school teacher, a very respected member of the community. Someone who did not live with willing executioners in Goldhagen's terms. I think that's complete nonsense when looking at this area, at least. I spent a lot of time doing research in the area. But grew up with Germans that respected and valued the contributions of Jews. But then, and this is the crucial point, when the Nazis came to power as a plurality, never a majority party, the Germans who had gone to school with his father, those who had been respected by his father, those who had turned to his family for education and other issues, they did not stand up to defend his family. The memory Henry Kissinger has, and this would be true for many other German Jews, and I did try to interview quite a number. I'm of Ostjuden background, so I don't fit into this category. But the memory of many German Jews is just the memory of that. It's the memory not of rampant intolerance. It's the memory of weak democracy, of the inability, the unwillingness of ordinary, good, well-educated Germans to stand up and defend those who are being attacked. Kissinger and many of those like him, we could put Hans Morgenthau into that category, Hannah Arendt, the list could go on and on. Those German Jews who come to the United States, they come to the United States because they are fleeing from that society, and they come to the United States at a time when the United States, despite its own anti-Semitism, is extraordinarily open to that sociological group of people. The United States is open to them because the United States functionally needs them in the war effort. That's why World War II is so important. Kissinger comes to New York City, to Washington Heights, north of Columbia University, in 1938. Incidentally, as I said, my family on my mother's side is of East European Jewish background. I had never visited Washington Heights until I did work on this project. I grew up in New York. My East European Jewish background is the Lower East Side. Those two communities never really met as such. Washington Heights was not an area where Jews were integrated into American society. Most read newspaper was the Aufbau. That was an area where German Jews lived as German Jews. It was World War II. It was the experience of the army. It was the experience in particular of returning to Germany, representing the United States, that transformed Kissinger's career. It's absolutely crucial, I go into this in detail in the book, it's absolutely crucial that for Kissinger and many others like him, they became American in the Army, not in high school, not in any kind of democratic setting, but in the most, in a sense, authoritarian setting possible within American society. And they became American in Germany, overseeing the occupation of the place that they had been forced to flee. In fact, Kissinger's first duties in counterintelligence are to oversee the occupation of two towns, Bensheim and Krefeld, and in these areas, among other things, to protect the German citizens from being mistreated by the American Army officers who come into the area. American Army officers were nowhere near as bad as the Soviet officers, as Svetlana and others know, but Army soldiers are Army soldiers in a time of war. Kissinger becomes, like so many others around him, becomes Americanized in that setting. And that transforms his view of American society, transforms his view of international politics, and his view of democracy. Fundamentally, his view of American society is a view of American society being connected to Europe, both spiritually and strategically, and connected in a common defense of Western civilization against not only external enemies, but also internal weaknesses. External enemies and internal weaknesses. And those of you who have looked at the work of George Kennan and others can see this in the thinking there as well. Deep within American thinking at the end of World War II and the early Cold War is a deep concern about the weakness of democracy, as great as the concern about external threats. And the defense, the definition of American society in this transatlantic valence has three enormous implications that I try to bring out in the book that I don't think you can understand Henry Kissinger's foreign policy without paying attention to. The first is this fundamental skepticism about democracy. Democracy is not a program for foreign policy. Democracy is not a program for foreign policy for Henry Kissinger, for Hans Morgenthau, for Hannah Arendt, down the line. People with many different politics, but a shared background in that sense. Second common implication for policy making. The United States is a savior nation. Kissinger uses that phrase time and again in the private documentation and in his memoirs and public documentation. It's a point I'll come back to later. But the United States, Kissinger said to me, and he said it in many other places, saved me and my family. And in fact, it's funny, Kissinger and I did an event in New York a few weeks ago, and the point he kept making over and over again, denying that he's skeptical about democracy, was that the United States could never be a totalitarian society because he had seen totalitarian societies and the United States was the alternative, by definition, axiomatically for him. It is a savior society for his generation, and of course it really was, and always viewed as such. It has a special, exceptional moral valence to him. And third and most important, the world that Kissinger lives in, the world that his generation in many ways lived in, was a world where the connection between the U.S. and Europe, therefore, was not simply strategic, but it was deeply about defending an idea of civilization. The German Jews of Germany defined their Germanness by their connection to German culture, to Bildung. And Kissinger and his generation would define their Americanness by a connection to an idea of Western civilization. This is not necessarily a Huntingtonian view of the world, but it is somewhat close to that. There's little room in Kissinger's worldview for egalitarian treatment of societies outside of that Western civilizational mold. That's axiomatic for him as well. Of course, how one treats non-first world societies will differ from one person to another, but nonetheless, that hierarchical view of the international system that seems such an anathema to my students today at the University of Wisconsin is taken for granted by that generation. Now, I think this gets us into the second area I wanted to cover, which is the role of knowledge in foreign policy, because I think those three assumptions, which are based on experience, but deeply ideological, deeply knowledge-based as much as experience-based, that those assumptions color foreign policy making, and they color the new institutions that underpin American Cold War policy making. The most significant insight for me in working on this was how all of a sudden those assumptions become a leverage for legitimacy and influence in making policy for someone like Henry Kissinger. Kissinger becomes a policymaker, and this is true for many other traditional outsiders like a Zbigniew Brzezinski, even a Condoleezza Rice, because an attachment to a certain set of ideals, to a certain perspective and a certain set of experiences connected to that provide legitimacy in the eyes of empowered figures. Or as Kissinger put it to me in one of his blunter moments, you know, I had to work my entire career with patrons who needed what I did, who believed what I believed, but did not like my kind. I think it's one of his most honest comments, actually. This is the story of William Eliot at Harvard, his mentor there. This is the story of Nelson Rockefeller. This is the story of Richard Nixon. It is a common belief in the United States as a savior nation, a hierarchical view of the world, and a skepticism about democracy, and then the experiences and skills that Kissinger develops as a strategic thinker, or at least he claims, as a historian, or at least he claims, as a negotiator, or at least he claims. It is those experiences connected to that ideological framework that gives him legitimacy in the eyes of policymakers. He does not become a policymaker working through any kind of traditional bureaucracy. He's never in the Foreign Service. He does not become a policymaker because of wealth. He does not get into office by buying an ambassadorship. He does not become a policymaker by getting elected to anything, right? As Sam Rayburn said to Lyndon Johnson, one of my favorite quotes, right? The problem with all the guys in the White House in the 60s was that none of them had been elected county sheriff, except for Lyndon Johnson, right? Kissinger falls into that perfectly. He becomes a policymaker because of the ideas he has and the new networks that form around those. These networks include the Center for International Affairs at Harvard, and they include the expanding range of the White House as a policymaking institution. It is, in fact, the centering of policy in the White House through the expansion of the NSC that begins with McGeorge Bundy that is the basis for Kissinger's policy advising and later his policy making. And I think this is the crucial point we need to keep in mind for three of the key foreign policy issues substantively that I talk about in the book: Vietnam, détente, and the Middle East. In the case of Vietnam, it strikes me that Kissinger's policies can only be understood in a very different way from Lyndon Johnson's. If Lyndon Johnson was about choosing war for a series of domestic political reasons, for reasons related to anti-communism and reasons related perhaps to a modernizing ideology, Kissinger's perspective was all about credibility, all about protecting American strength overseas. As he wrote, I think quite honestly, there is no room in my worldview for the self-hating perspective on American society that so many of those long-haired protesters had. Right? I think you very clearly get a sense of how he saw this so differently, and he was certainly not alone. The Vietnam War was something he was never deeply enthusiastic about, but he strongly, strongly opposed any argument, any policy that would show weakness or perceived weakness for the United States there. And the perhaps morally reprehensible policy of the Nixon administration of trying to withdraw while escalating was just about that, just about maintaining credibility in those terms, with abhorrent results, certainly, but having to be understood, it seems to me, in that context. Not apologizing for it, but understanding it in that context. Détente, I think, falls into exactly the same framework. For Kissinger, détente was about protecting order and protecting Western civilization. This Sonnenfeld doctrine is, I think, the clearest representation of, in fact, what Kissinger was thinking. There was an East and there was a West. And the West represented the areas that needed to be protected, the East less so. And a world of stability and principles of rules guiding behavior would provide for stable protection of Western civilization. What happened in Eastern Europe, what happened in Chile, what happened elsewhere was less significant in those terms for him. And he was certainly willing to tolerate far more misdeeds, far greater level of misdeeds in those areas, and he should be criticized for that. But it's within a framework that represents and in his terms sees the core value in Western society. What did détente provide for Kissinger? Well, it provided in his terms a protection for Western civilization, a protection for order in those societies. Even more deeply, in his terms, it protected a basis for not simply peace but cooperation, a basis for not human rights, but what he defined as the elements of human dignity, which for him included good governance, i.e., Western-style governance, and included protection against extremism of the left or the right. In this sense, he was a classic Burkean conservative in his view of détente, a classic Burkean conservative. This doesn't apologize for his views of other areas of the world, but we have to take that seriously, it seems to me, and then maybe go ahead and criticize it. But we have to take it seriously first for what it was and understand that it was, in fact, perhaps more the mainstream view than out of the mainstream as such. And the third huge implication, I think, of all of this, and the one I want to spend a little time on because I think it connects to contemporary policy in important ways, is the Middle East. The Middle East. And Salim Yarkoub knows more about this than I do, but I'm fascinated, endlessly fascinated with Kissinger's role in the Middle East for a number of reasons. I just want to spend a few minutes on this. First, I think I read everything Kissinger ever wrote, at least published form. I have not read every single document. I can't keep up with Tom and Bill Burr and others in that. But I think I've read everything he's published. I have a whole study at home that my wife wants to empty out, filled with this stuff. And the amazing thing is, before 1969, he writes absolutely nothing about the Middle East. Writes about every other part of the world in detail. In fact, writes about non-political things in detail. He has a whole series of wonderful Kissinger articles about soccer, and Pele as the Bismarck of soccer. She's very revealing about how Kissinger conceives charismatic leadership. The Middle East is the one area he stays away from. He visits Israel, I think, once before 1969. He's a man who's traveled probably almost as much, if not more, than anyone else of his generation. Stays away from that part of the world. And even in office from 1969 on, certainly during the Black September incident and during the early 1970s, he's an active policymaker behind the scenes. But in public, it's the area he tries to cede to Rogers. There can be a Rogers plan, even though Kissinger is sabotaging it, because at least in public, he's willing to allow for at least the perception that he's not the one running policy. I don't think you can get away from Kissinger's Jewishness on this particular issue. I think he feels a particular discomfort with that area of the world because of his background. And I think everything I've said comes together in the Middle East in 1973. Kissinger is thrust to the forefront of making American policy, in part because he wants to be the one making policy, but in part because of the war, and in part because of Watergate and Nixon's progressive, shall we say, movement away from daily policy management. As you all, I think, know, at the time when the United States raises the nuclear alert in October 73, Nixon is invited to the meeting and does not show up. So the decision to raise the American nuclear alert, to raise the DEFCON in October 73 is done without the president present, because the president is busy with Watergate issues at the time. So Kissinger finds himself in a position just after being appointed Secretary of State, where he's got to dominate policy in a way beyond even where he was before. But more significant, I think, he finds himself in a situation now where he has to negotiate his Jewishness on a daily basis. During the shuttle diplomacy, reading the documents, I'm struck by how ever-present his Jewishness is. He brings it up, and others bring it up with him all the time. The Saudi leadership quite frequently begins its meetings with him by giving him copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is their standard procedure, simply to remind him. Ismail Fahmy, Sadat's foreign minister, brings this up time and again with Kissinger, his relationship to Israel, the ways in which Jews run the world, and how Kissinger must work through that. And Rabin and Golda Meir, in their own ways, bring this up time and again. We expect more from you because of who you are, Henry. In those terms. It's not everything, but it's on the table, it seems to me. And I think we can best understand what he does in the Middle East as an effort to negotiate what has always been an issue for him, his combined skepticism of democracy and his discomfort with his role as a Jewish policymaker in an American milieu. What he does in the Middle East is he searches not for a stable peace. He doesn't look for any kind of solution to what are religious and geopolitical problems. He searches for leaders he can hinge stability upon. This is an anti-democratic solution to the region, I think quite explicitly. And the relationship he develops between Sadat and Rabin, and I think those are the most important relationships for him. I think they become the basis for Camp David, the basis, quite honestly, I think, for the only agreement that's held in the Middle East for 30 years. His relationship with Sadat and Rabin is very much in those terms. They are strong state leaders. They are moderates. They are not people who want to support final solutions of any kind. And they are leaders who are willing to make quick decisions. He likes this about Sadat in particular. Sadat will just negotiate with him on the fly. Able to make quick geopolitical decisions and stick to them. And Kissinger recognizes that his Jewishness in those terms can actually be a strength. He says to Brent Scowcroft, his advisor, assistant at the time, says, "You know, in the Arab world, I have a funny magical quality. They think I can do things others can't do." Well, why do they think he can do things others can't do? Well, they actually think Jews run the world, and they think he's the top Jew. And he never, when Fahmy says as much, he never argues against that. And he plays the same card with the Israelis and American Jews. Some of the most interesting interviews for me, and we also have minutes of these meetings, are the first all-Jewish meetings ever held in the State Department, when Kissinger is Secretary of State. And at these meetings, Kissinger invites, and this is classic Kissinger, he invites all the leading Jewish intellectuals and public figures, brings them to the State Department. Michael Walzer, Rita Hauser, Henry Rosofsky, and others. Henry Rosofsky is the one I interviewed most extensively. Henry Rosofsky was in Germany with Kissinger in 1945. He'd been an immigrant to the United States, gone back like Kissinger as part of the U.S. Army effort. Rosofsky was then in graduate school with Kissinger, and Rosofsky became both the first Jewish dean at Harvard in the late 1960s, and he became the leader of the foreign policy wing for the American Jewish Congress. And Rosofsky said some wonderful things to me about these meetings. He said, these meetings with Kissinger were extraordinary. We called him everything in the book, and you can read the minutes of this. We called him a Chamberlain. We called him a sellout. We called him a self-hating Jew. But in the end, Henry always reminded us, and he always reminded Yitzhak, he means Rabin here, though Rosofsky didn't know Rabin well, but he liked to refer to him as Yitzhak, and he always reminded Yitzhak that he was the first Jewish Secretary of State, and after him, there might not be another, and that we wouldn't get anyone any better. Reminded us that he was one of us. And you can see him nudge Rabin in these ways. You can see him nudge those groups in these ways. His ethnic background was not something separate from his policy, and it did not explain everything about his policy, but it was an intimate part of his policy. By the way, I don't make this argument as deeply in the book because I can't prove it, but I think one of the reasons he doesn't care about the Russian Jews is because they're Russian Jews and not German Jews. I think there's a different valence in his eyes between these. In the end, what I think we can see is two big things that I really want to maybe focus our discussion on a little bit in addition to everything else. One, the way in which background, experience, and the ideas formed from background and experience matter. They don't apologize for behavior. They don't necessarily mean we should say nice things about the person's behavior, but they're crucial to understanding the person's behavior. And this background, these ideas, this experience were not unique to Kissinger. In fact, they filled the State Department and those who came of age in his generation in the State Department. When Kissinger's appointing his assistant secretaries of state, his problem is he has trouble finding non-Jews to appoint in the 1970s, whereas the opposite was the case 30 years earlier. And a high proportion of them are of similar background, not necessarily the same politics. Second big implication, it seems to me, is that Kissinger deeply believed that the United States had a special mission in the world. And I deeply believe the United States has a special mission in the world. But Kissinger failed not in defining a special mission for the United States, but in making that mission workable in a world that's terribly diverse, or wonderfully diverse, depending upon your point of view. It is not that the American mission is corrupt, at least in my mind, and I don't think Kissinger is corrupt as a representative of that. But it is that Americans have not figured out, as Kissinger has not figured out, how we can make our mission work in a context where people have rational and reasonable reasons not to see us as the good people we think we are. That is Kissinger's deepest failing, and that is our deepest failing. That was our failing in Vietnam, and that's the failing we're recreating in Iraq. And it seems to me that we need to talk about it in those terms if we're going to work our way through this. And that's really where I close the book, and where I'll close for now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Mel Leffler?
Well, I want to begin by saying that this is truly a wonderful book. It's very, very stimulating. It's provocative in the best sense. It's very well researched. Jeremy, I don't think mentioned it here, but Jeremy carried on probably more interviews with Henry Kissinger than I think any other researcher has been able to do. And I think the book benefits tremendously as a result of those interviews. The book, as Jeremy suggested, is not a description of Kissinger's diplomacy. If you're looking for a detailed analysis of détente with the Soviet Union or rapprochement with China, or even the Middle East policies, this is not the book that you want to go to if you want to probe those issues in depth. nor is it an analysis of Kissinger's relationship with President Nixon, as intriguing as that would be, and as Robert Dallek has shown can lead to quite a few book sales as well. But it's not an analysis of Kissinger's relationship with Nixon. Instead, and much to the merit of the book, the volume is a deep and probing inquiry into why Kissinger did what he did. It's a probing inquiry into why so many members of America's elite establishment vested as much power in Henry Kissinger as they did at different points in time. And Jeremy shows, I think, very persuasively that Kissinger was both a fascinating figure, quote, end quote, and a shadow figure, quote, end quote. Kissinger, Jeremy writes, was a German, a Jew, and an American. He was an idealist and a realist, an internationalist, and a patriot. He was a mixture of familiar and exotic ingredients that made the American century. The book is entitled Henry Kissinger and the American Century. Assumedly, Kissinger reflected something very deep about the American century. And according to Jeremy, Kissinger was also an agent of globalization, a key theme of the book. His influence, however, came from the fact that he was from the social margins. His life, according to Jeremy, reveals the interpenetration, and I'm quoting, of ideas, personalities, and institutions from diverse societies. Now, the book, if you've read reviews, already has aroused considerable controversy. And I think this is much to Jeremy's credit. The reason it has generated as much controversy as it has, as quickly as it has, is that basically, fundamentally, Jeremy Suri provides a sympathetic portrait of Henry Kissinger. Trying to understand Kissinger, he writes about him in ways that Kissinger, I think, would like. He defines Kissinger as a good man. He entered politics for moral reasons, and he worked feverishly, Jeremy writes, to make the world a better place. Good men, says Jeremy, made policy during the Cold War, and Kissinger was one of these good men. He acted within the bounds of a strong moral compass. He and his kind are noteworthy for their accomplishments and failures, but those accomplishments and failures, Jeremy Suri stresses, were not genetic. They were inscribed by the environment. Now, this is a critical yet sympathetic view of Kissinger. This view of Kissinger as a good man, I think, has actually, in the many reviews that have already come out, diverted attention from Jeremy's most critical contribution, which I think he very ably summed up here. The book is really a book about Kissinger's German Jewishness. That is what the book is about. Something that Kissinger, I believe, has always denied was a decisive influence on what he did. And Jeremy shows in very vivid ways, very vivid and I think unarguable, undisputable ways, how important Kissinger's German Jewishness was. It shaped his sense of opportunities and his choices. It defined Kissinger's fears and Kissinger's hopes. It influenced his understanding of power and the appropriate uses of power. Growing up in Weimar, Kissinger's German Jewishness taught him, as Jeremy has stressed here today, that democracies had a very dark side indeed. They were fragile. They were subject to the passions and the hatreds of the multitudes. Civilizational values had to be protected by strong leadership, a point that Jeremy hasn't emphasized today, but is a very, very key part of the book. Strong leadership was key. Leaders protected basic freedoms and nurtured respect for civilizational values like the rule of law, the sanctity of private property, and the existence of a Judeo-Christian deity. Kissinger's German Jewishness also empowered him, and Jeremy shows this very, very persuasively in the book. His German Jewishness enabled him to be both an insider and an outsider, a bridge figure. He was part of the elite, but not of the elite. He could be used by the elite, and he could do things that they very much wanted him to do. During the occupation, when he was a very young army soldier, the fact that he was a German Jew enabled him to reach out to the Germans and to do things as a young man in his early 20s that few could have imagined doing. Later on, in the 1950s and 60s, he was able to reach out to Europeans more broadly and to help construct a transatlantic Judeo-Christian identity and a Judeo-Christian community that was really an imaginative construct of the post-war generation, as Jeremy has emphasized today. Finally, Kissinger's German Jewishness attuned him to the dangers of totalitarianism. Jeremy writes, a religious sensibility gave meaning to politics and to diplomacy. It was essential for determining the means and ends of strategy. In the 1950s, Kissinger saw that the Soviet Union constituted a dire threat. The defeating the Soviet Union for Kissinger was part of a world historical struggle to protect an imperfect but a free society. For the German Jewish émigré, saving democracy from the treachery of its totalitarian adversaries and the weaknesses of its own constituents required self-conscious efforts to rescue an element of choice from the pressure of circumstances. No one can read this book and think about Henry Kissinger any longer and his policies apart from his German Jewishness. And I think that is a distinctive contribution to the literature, and it makes this book extraordinarily important and evocative. But Jeremy doesn't attribute everything to Kissinger's Jewishness. He writes, his Jewishness conditioned his relationships with prominent post-war figures, although it did not determine his ideas and actions. His Jewishness influenced the questions he asked, the personal networks he formed, and the paths he followed. I think this quotation reveals some tension and contradictions in the book about the actual salience of his Jewishness, whether it did or did not shape his ideas and his actions. So aside from his German Jewishness, what else shaped his ideas? What is clear from the book that what shaped Kissinger's ideas was frankly his intellectual brilliance. And Jeremy describes this. Kissinger wrote brilliantly about nuclear weapons in the 1950s. He wrote about how to make the nuclear arsenal credible as a threat to enemies while at the same time being acceptable as a source of security for allies, as well as useful to the United States as diplomatic leverage. Kissinger wrote brilliantly about power. All of Kissinger's ideas about power, about policy, Jeremy writes, all of his ideas about policy begin and end with a focus on the limits of power. Kissinger incisively saw the evolution in the distribution of power in the 1960s, and therefore became attuned to the need for negotiation, compromise, and accommodation. I'm quoting, I think, a really incisive sentence. The only practical solution to the Cold War, according to Kissinger, was to transform the structure of the international system, encouraging a diffusion of power on terms favorable to the United States of America. From this intellectual framework stemmed Kissinger's growing penchant for détente with the Soviet Union and rapprochement with the People's Republic of China. From this framework, Kissinger also worked to design a hierarchical world order dependent on regional powers and on regional leaders, many of whom were brutal dictators. And here's where Kissinger's brilliance was diminished by his German Jewish sensibilities. His policies reflected his formative years, his skepticism of democracy, his belief in cultural hierarchy, his faith in state power, and his fear of political chaos. The moral content of the interests of the U.S. state was taken for granted by Kissinger. The moral content of the interests of the U.S. state was a given for Kissinger. And as a result, his policies empowered oppressors. Quote from Jeremy, "These men, these brutal dictators, cooperated with Washington while they brutalized their own populations." End quote. Kissinger accepted this. In a cruel and violent world, powerful leaders, not democratic politics, offered the best protection for life and liberty. Statesmanship required toleration of brutality as a bulwark against worse suffering. Consequently, although suspicious and resentful of Nixon, Kissinger worked collaboratively with the president. They both believed, quote, sound progress required firm national leadership, end quote. Regarding Vietnam, they both saw the American dream endangered by international communism abroad and by domestic critics at home. They feared the suicidal breakdown of domestic order, fears of democratic weakness. Inspired by Kissinger's German Jewishness, fears of democratic weakness inspired by his German Jewishness limited Kissinger's strategic imagination, inclined him to spy on his own colleagues, and to abuse executive authority in unprecedented ways. The above is Suri's arguments. But it was not just Kissinger's German Jewishness, I would suggest. After all, many German Jews, some of whom Jeremy has alluded to, actually opposed Kissinger's policies and his actions and his disregard of constitutional limits and authority. What was critical to understanding Kissinger, I would suggest, was not just his German Jewishness, but his personality. I would contest the statement that Jeremy makes at the beginning that accomplishments and failures had nothing to do with genetics, broadly defined. I think Kissinger's accomplishments and failures had a lot to do with his personality. His brilliance was diminished by his personality, his overarching ambition, his deep insecurity, his intimidating arrogance, his insatiable egocentrism, his jarring self-centeredness, his sycophantic attitude toward a mercurial president, his suspiciousness, his abuse of power, and broadly stated, his vanity. These traits interacted with his Jewishness, dimmed his brilliance, and bequeathed a legacy that makes one wonder if he was the good man, quote, end quote, that Suri says he was at the onset of his book. These traits and attitudes also make me wonder if he typified the American century. Could a man who put order above freedom, stability above justice, balance above opportunity really typify the American century? Was the American century really a century in which, quote, the language of democracy proliferated, but the practice of democracy narrowed? And was he an agent of globalization? Was a man who was relatively indifferent to economic imperatives and technological innovation, who spent rather little time dwelling on the electronics and communications revolutions, who often subordinated the significance of corporate power, trade and capital flows, and labor unrest, who knew little of popular culture and wrote sparsely about the appeal of consumer capitalism? Could such a man really be emblematic of globalization trends and the erosion of state power in the 20th century? I'm not sure. Nor is Jeremy, actually. Because at the end of the book, Jeremy seems to question his own judgments that he makes at the beginning of his book. And I think he does this in an intellectually honest way. It's not just a contradiction. It's an author wrestling with really conflicting evidence. At the end, Jeremy outlines Kissinger's relations with dictators, with conservative Arab leaders, and with violent insurgent leaders. Yet he gravitates back to his original judgment by looking at recent actions in Iraq and the Middle East. Promoting democracy and regime change, a la George W. Bush, has been a failure. And so Jeremy concludes, quote, no alternative strategic vision for managing the Middle East and other regions of the world has emerged in the place of Kissinger's vision. Rhetoric about democracy does not provide a path forward in dealing with violence and hatred, Jeremy writes. International peace requires a careful calibration of means and ends, as well as a coherent integration of various challenges. It requires trade-offs that defy simple slogans, end quote. And I agree. Jeremy is right. But did Kissinger successfully manage these trade-offs? Did he provide an appropriate path for policy beyond slogans? I don't really think so. And that's because I don't think that Henry Kissinger was the good man that Suri claims he was. He was too egocentric, sycophantic, suspicious, and abusive of power. Nor was Kissinger, in my view, the flawed architect that Jussi Hanamaki so incisively describes in his recent analysis of Henry Kissinger. In my view, Henry Kissinger was neither a good man nor a flawed architect. He was, in my view, a flawed man, gifted with a brilliant mind, inexhaustible energy, admirable self-discipline. He was bedeviled by his own egocentrism, arrogance, and vanity. His German Jewishness did limit his vision and circumscribe his imagination. But his German Jewishness was only part of the story. Kissinger's actions resulted from the peculiar embodiment of exquisite and brilliant German Jewish sensibilities within a personality of overweening ambition and insatiable vanity. His legacy is more mixed than Suri suggests. His legacy makes one wonder if he managed the trade-offs quite as well as Jeremy implies. Has Kissinger, in fact, left us with a path beyond slogans, with a practical guide to action? Jeremy forces us to think anew about these things. And that is why, ultimately, this is such a stimulating, worthwhile, and important book. Thank you.
Just to defend Jeremy from Mel's onslaught slightly, I will say that I think our author is struggling in other places in the book, not just the end. I was especially struck and noted down on page 210, Jeremy has Kissinger and Nixon turning the White House into a gangster den. And that's a quote. So I also really appreciated the struggle and the attempt to have an extraordinary level of empathy with Kissinger. I think that really comes through the book, and that's an essential job for a scholar and historian. Extremely impressive, even though I would join in a lot of Mel's critiques of that. But let me open this up to questions. Yes, sir, please just identify yourself. I think we have microphones. Yeah, Tim, there you go. Thanks. Just identify yourself and try to keep short, and we'll give Jeremy and Mel both a chance.
My name is Stephen Shore. Let me ask a counterfactual question. Kissinger is born in the same place and the same time, but without a drop of Jewish blood. Would he not have been personally happier and more productive working for an authoritarian German foreign office, if not necessarily a totalitarian one, than working within the democratic confines of the United States?
Well, I mean, thank you, Steve. It's a hard one to grapple with, because it's so hard for me to think of him outside of his German Jewishness. But I will say that there's no doubt there was a tendency that he had, and many other historians like George Massey have written about this. There was a tendency that German Jews in that region, Orthodox German Jews, and I didn't talk about his orthodoxy, but that's an important part, that Orthodox German Jews in that region had to identify with conservative parties in Germany. Now, we have to be careful, because the conservatives were actually more deeply anti-Nazi in some cases than those on the left. So this is not to say they identify with that at all, but there was a grappling and attachment to strong authoritarian leaderships. And in Bavaria, this is particularly important, and something I mentioned in the book, because, in fact, the Jews were emancipated in Bavaria by an absolutist monarch in the mid-19th century, and then that emancipation had to be rescinded because of popular opposition. So the way in which Jews defined their careers as civil servants and as servants of a centralized state. So, yeah, I think there's something to what you're saying. I just wouldn't want to push it too far, because, asking what he would do if he were not Jewish, is like asking, what I would do if my father wasn't from India. I don't know. I mean, so it's hard to work one's way through that.
Yes, sir, in the back, and then here in the
Jeremy, John Cooper. Let's one more crack at the counterfactual. Can you imagine Kissinger rising and achieving the power and the role that he did without Nixon, with some other president, with some other kind of person?
Well, John, I think so. I mean, I think it would have been different, and Tom and Mel both referred to that and the importance of the relationship between Nixon and Kissinger. But, Hubert Humphrey says, I think it's in 70 or so, he says that, he was going to give Kissinger a high-level position as well. Now, the relationship between Humphrey and Kissinger would have been different, and I think Humphrey would not have gone along with some of the abuse of power that Mel so well articulated. So it would have been different. But I think Kissinger was going to be a powerful player in either a Democratic or Republican administration in '68. He had set himself up so well for that. He's working for Johnson on the Vietnam negotiations. He's working for Nixon as well. And, of course, a lot has been written about that. He's got connections to Humphrey. And, of course, his wing of the Republican Party, the Rockefeller wing, is a truly moderate part of that party that could go either way. So I think he's got a powerful position with either of them. And we do know from the Truman years on, I mean, he is a player. I mean, my graduate students there in Jaws drop when I tell them he was briefing the Psychological Strategy Board in 1952 as a graduate student. I mean, he's someone, he's worked his way into that environment. But, of course, it would have been different. The personality of Nixon and the abuse of power that's going on there, that both of them contribute to, makes that a unique moment, I think.
Right here.
I'm Jerry Livingston from the German Historical Institute here in town. I've got two questions. The first one is, can you say a little something about Kissinger's relation with another Harvard foreign policy intellectual, Bob Bowie? My first question. My second question, and here I guess I should preface it with a little full disclosure, I served in the National Security Council from 1971 to 1973. So my question is, can you say something about Kissinger's attitudes toward Willy Brandt, toward Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, his policy of détente, and toward the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, as a political entity?
Sure, those are great questions. Thank you, Jerry. He and Bob Bowie have a very tortured relationship. And I made the mistake of once asking Bob Bowie about this, and 20 minutes later I was able to get another question in. Bowie was, when they create the Center for International Affairs at Harvard, which is actually created in '58, but the work for it begins in 1956, and it's McGeorge Bundy, who's then dean, and William Elliott, who is Kissinger's sort of mentor there, and Elliott had been in the Office of Price Administration during the war and hadn't really done anything since he'd written a book about pragmatism in the 1930s, I think. But Elliott and Bundy put this together, and they bring in Bob Bowie from the policy planning staff because they want someone who has policy experience running. This is an effort by Harvard to be policy relevant, quite explicit. I call this the Cold War University. All universities did this. Harvard sort of did it on a higher scale. Kissinger is made associate director because they want someone who has more academic heft than Bowie, but they want someone who's not a traditional academic either. And so the interesting thing there is the tension between the policymaker and the person who sees himself with his feet in both worlds. They did not get along very well at all. Part of it was Kissinger's ruthless ambition. I mean, he saw the Center for International Affairs as his institute, and of course Bowie saw it differently. And Kissinger wanted to work all sides of every issue. So I think there are a variety of things. One thing where they come together is on flexible response. You could argue in the late 1950s, Bowie is really, I think, and Richard Immerman's written a lot about this, is one of the people within the policy planning staff who's trying to argue for a more flexible nuclear strategy than what Eisenhower's pursuing. And Kissinger picks up that argument in Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, makes that argument famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, in 1957, 58. So there's a parallel there, but there's a lot of tension. And no one who was ever Kissinger's supervisor liked him.
Or subordinate.
Well, that's good.
No, ask him.
Oh, I loved it, right?
Yeah, you adored it.
That's saying, yeah. No, it's interesting because Win Lord is pretty loyal to him. So, Willy Brandt, Egon Bahr, and the FRG. I say a fair amount about this in the book. The relationship to the West German government is very strong, and his hero, I think his hero of the post-war world after Churchill, is Adenauer. And Adenauer sees that, and Adenauer exploits that. Adenauer refuses to meet, often even with the American ambassador, doesn't like to meet with Dowling, calls him Dorfling. But he does meet, but he meets with Kissinger quite frequently. Cultivates Kissinger. There's a lot of foreign ministry correspondence in the German foreign ministry about how they see Kissinger as a potentially favorable person. So he's cultivated by the CDU and Adenauer, and he have a reasonably good relationship. Brandt, Kissinger sees with more suspicion, but I think it's a mixed relationship. I think he also respects the nimbleness that Brandt and Barr bring to bear. It becomes more a rivalry than it does a sort of opposition or hostility. And of course, you know better than I do the names that Kissinger calls Barr and things like that. But I think they work as rivals, but also rivals within an alliance structure. And one of the strengths of the Western Alliance at the time is it can accommodate. It can accommodate a de Gaulle, it can accommodate an Egon Barr and a Willy Brandt.
Yes, sir. Bring the mic, Tim. Thanks.
Murray Martyr of the Neiman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. Having spent years with Kissinger, I can understand, I recognize that you explained that you did not go into the Nixon
Microphone. Turn the mic so it's pointing into your...
I recognize that you did not go, as you say, I have not read the book, into the Nixon factor greatly. But I wonder if you are aware of the extent of the Haldeman-Ehrlichman factor, who Kissinger privately would describe to people who he thought would not repeat it, as the Germans. And they were, in effect, virtually his daily keepers. They were the ones, not Nixon, who conveyed instructions to him. And he once told a couple of us...
Try it again. I think the mic is...
Your hand off the bottom.
He once told a couple of us, Marvin Kalb, Bernie Kalb, that at times he said, I don't know if I'm the director of the play or an actor in it.
Yeah. Don't hold the bottom of the
mic. It's okay, I'll repeat the question. It's all right. So,
he said, I don't know sometimes I don't know if I'm the director of the play or an actor in it.
Yeah. There's no doubt that Ehrlichman and Haldeman in particular, I'd say Haldeman more than Ehrlichman, have a great deal of control, especially in the first Nixon administration. But I think this will give me an opportunity to talk about personality a bit. I think also Kissinger was spinning you, though. I mean, because
did everyone he spoke to, as you know.
Right, of course, and including me. I mean, but what you see in the documentation and the National Security Archive has been so valuable in getting this out is how often he's meeting with the president, how he is able to get around them sometimes, not on all issues, and then of course in the Haldeman diary, especially the non-published version. You see Haldeman saying the same thing about Kissinger in response, that he can't control Kissinger. So you've got this going both ways. I think Mel's point about Kissinger's overweening ambition and vanity is certainly right on. And I think one of the things Kissinger is unable to do is to share power with anyone else. And he's never groomed a successor or he's never groomed any kind of protege. He feels deeply threatened by any kind of rival. And I think that contributes to the dysfunctional nature of the White House. I think that's a very important part of his personality. I guess where I have trouble thinking this through, and I'm still struggling with it, is, of course, his personality matters. And maybe it's a matter of degree. But all the qualities you've laid out, Mel, are true for most American policymakers. Most of them are egotistical. Most of them have ruthless ambition. Most of them have incredible vanity. I mean, everything you said is McGeorge Bundy and Robert McNamara and Don Rumsfeld and, I mean, even to some extent George Shultz. I mean, is it just a matter of degree then?
Well, I think a matter of degree becomes more than just a matter at a certain point, and I mean, you might also compare him maybe to a Cyrus Vance,
George Marshall,
or a George Marshall, or Robert Lovett. I mean, I think all people who rise to this level, you're exactly right, have a great deal of ambition, but I think that these transcripts that we now have admittedly, we don't have the same types of transcripts for others, but it's hard to imagine Robert Lovett or Cyrus Vance talking the way that Henry Kissinger talks. it's hard to imagine them talking to journalists about the slights that he has suffered, the degree to which they haven't focused sufficient attention on his achievements and things of that sort. Of course, at a certain point, this becomes epiphenomenal, and the key point then becomes, how does it shape some of his policies, the very things we're thinking about? And what I have trouble with, I think your book, and I really mean this honestly, is a just terrific book. But at a certain point, what are the most salient factors in Kissinger's support for Pinochet or his support for the insurgents in Angola? Is it really his German Jewishness, or does it relate to certain other fundamental factors and his own sense of vulnerability and the fact that he's going to be subject to criticism if he doesn't do these things? Some of these things he does to build up his own credibility with this mercurial president who he has to demonstrate his toughness to, and to the others around him, as well as to an emerging right wing. And it seems to me that's not so much a function of his Jewishness. Some of the worst things that we associate with Kissinger, I think, are not relevant to his German Jewishness. They're much more relevant to these other factors, and not just personality, but politics, bureaucratic infighting, and things of that sort. And ultimately, how do you weigh these things?
Right.
You know?
Right. No,
I would throw one more factor into that list, and actually Jeremy remarks on it at one point, and then it drops out of the book. I think at one point you described Kissinger as possibly the most ignorant great statesman in history about the rest of the world.
Right.
It's an amazing thought that a guy, one of the answers to the question about Pinochet or about Angola or about any of these non-U.S. Europe dynamics is Kissinger's absolute ignorance and making it up on the fly.
Right.
And just with sort of reflexive reactions, as if find the closest available strong man and embrace him. And that was essentially U.S. policy.
No, I think all that's right. And to say that one's German Jewishness or any kind of background matters is not to say it determines those outcomes. But I guess if we're going to play the counterfactual game, I think if you pulled that out of not just his intellectual development, but the way his career develops, one can imagine him making different choices, even with the same kind of personality, even with a Robert McNamara or a McGeorge Bundy personality. I mean, let's take the example of Pinochet, right? His ignorance comes in his not understanding what staging a coup in a society that has a tradition of civil-military relations where this doesn't happen, what that will do to this society. That's his ignorance, but every American policymaker at that level would fall into that. What's significant about his decision with regard to...
No, many did not. I mean, that's the key question. And what the documents actually show is that each stage of these policy choices, say on Angola, huge internal debate where Kissinger actually rides roughshod over the area specialists and the folks who, in an interagency process, say, no way we should intervene covertly. Kissinger rides over them with ignorance, with trailing his ignorance.
Fair enough, but I would argue I don't know the Angola case as well, though I've read Glahese's book. I don't know those documents as well. In the case of Chile, I'd say that, of course, there are area experts, but I'd say the White House consensus is actually with Kissinger and Nixon. I don't think he actually has to push as hard. The WSAG group is operating the covert actions. I mean, he's got full support from Helms. He's got full support from Nixon. I mean, yes, there are people in the field who are writing in, but the White House consensus, the bias, is actually to do this. That doesn't let him off the hook. That doesn't let him off the hook. That doesn't let him off the hook. But of course, so the point I'm trying to make is actually that the emphasis upon toughness and the fear that a social democratic leadership that Allende represented that's close to Castro will bring chaos and extremism, that's born of his experience watching that. That's his reference point. This doesn't in any way excuse, and I hope I'm fairly critical. I think the Pinochet coup was a disaster. I mean, there's no other way to call it. Any regime. The irony is, here's someone who comes out of the Holocaust and is in the end supporting a regime that's rounding people up in stadiums and killing them. So this is not to justify that, but it is to say that his point of reference is not Chilean society. It's his own experience in Germany in the 1930s. Let me make this even clearer. This is something that's not in the book, but something he said to me just 2.5 weeks ago. We were talking about the election. It's one of the only 2 times I've talked to him since the book came out. But we was talking about the election, and he works for McCain, of course, and he said, I talked to him about why I thought Obama was exciting, and I knew Mel Leffler supported Obama. And Kissinger said to me, he said, yeah, I mean, this is almost a direct quote. He said, yeah, but that's dangerous. That's what Hitler did, mobilizing people. That's his point of reference. That does not fully explain his behavior. I think that's an essential part of understanding why he misunderstands Chile. Allende gets, 36% of the vote. Is that right? Yeah? And at 36 or 37% of the vote. And again, Allende should have been president in my eyes as well. To Kissinger, the Nazis got 38% of the vote. Getting 36% of the vote does not make you a legitimate leader in his eyes based on his experience. Again, he's wrong, but I'm quite convinced that's the way he sees it. I'm quite convinced his personality traits that Mel laid out allow him, make this easier. They facilitate that. But I think those personality traits could have facilitated other policies with a different intellectual frame of reference. I don't think it's possible for Kissinger to be Wilsonian based on where he comes from and his background in that sense.
But would you acknowledge the fact, or acknowledge the possibility, let's take that exact case, that there were other German Jews who had fled from Germany in the 1930s who were very critical of these very sorts of policies that Kissinger embraced, and that there were other elements of, quote, German Jewishness that were more important for them, that taught them other lessons about freedom and justice that were more important than the fragility of democratic society. Now, for Kissinger, that seemed to be the overwhelming frame of reference. But it wasn't, I think, for all German Jews. And, I mean, that's a question.
Well, I think that's right, but I think that's true in any case, right? I mean, I'm always amazed what students take from our classes, right? From our lectures, right? So, I mean, people interpret the world they live in different ways. And certainly, I mean, the people I mentioned before that you also alluded to, Hannah Arendt and Hans Morgenthau, do not agree with Kissinger on many issues. Certainly Morgenthau and Kissinger have an extended debate about the Vietnam War, for example. So it is not to say that their background determines their outcome, but it is to say if we want to understand why someone does something, I think that person's interpretation, which is related to personality, but it's about more than arrogance and vanity. Yep. No, it's about one's self-conception.
I totally agree with that. But the point of my comments is not to detract from your interpretation, which I think is essential for understanding Kissinger. It's trying to get the mix right, whatever right might mean.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So, and I don't disagree that all those characteristics are true about him, and I've felt that myself, even in talking to him, the little I've talked to him. But I think we tend to overstate those and understate the other. And maybe I'm overcompensating for that. Yeah. But I do think there's a tendency to hate Kissinger's personality and attribute it all to that.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Right in the front.
Chachin Bethesda Mellon. Generally from the conversation among you three, Dr. Suri, how come Kissinger come off clean in Nixon administration? And for curiosity, what is your title of your PhD dissertation? And to Dr. Leffler, also come from here on this page. Now Cold War is over. Do United States and the Soviet Union still the soul of mankind? Thank you.
I'm not sure that Kissinger came off clean in any of our discussion, and so.
But among your discussion, but outside it seems quite clean.
I don't know. I think the last time he stayed at the Hotel Crillon in Paris, he was served with a subpoena in cases of people disappeared in Latin America by an Italian magistrate who had worked through the French legal system. So I think it's slightly uncomfortable for him to travel to, say, Buenos Aires or Rio de Janeiro or Rome or Barcelona or Paris. So, history waits a long time to judge. The legal system sometimes waits almost as long, but it's out there.
No, and I think you're both right in a sense. I mean, I think that he definitely has not come out clean in that he's been the subject of prosecution. He's been the subject of some very critical treatments, and there are a lot of people.
Go to jail.
No, he didn't go to jail, but he doesn't. But I don't think he lives. He doesn't feel he's loved the way he should be loved in his terms. I think that's really, and this comes back to his vanity. But I think he's. I think
it's true of most of us.
Yes,
though, right?
absolutely. Join the crowd, Henry.
Do you need a hug, Mel? So I think Tom is absolutely right, and there are very few statesmen, thankfully, who to this date have been subpoenaed as war criminals, and he's come pretty close to that. In fact, he has been technically subpoenaed, right? So there is that side of it. On the other hand, there's no doubt, and I see where you're going with your question. Not only did he not go to jail, he is also treated as the foreign policy sage by another group of people, and there is this bifurcation, right? No other policymaker has remained out of office as influential as long as Kissinger. I mean, it's extraordinary that one could argue, and I think we will argue as historians when we get the documents, he will prove more influential for George W. Bush than George W. Bush's father.
So he got pulled on both sides, and he stayed in the middle.
Well, yeah, I think so, but I think actually he's still striving to appeal to those who, I think he really wants those who think he's a war criminal to think he's not. And I think he's trying to figure that out. He's never going to convince Tom, I know, but I think that's the reason that he talked to me. I think that's the reason why he doesn't keep his mouth shut. I mean, he's still making an appeal to history, and he's failing, but that's what he's doing, I think.
He may end up being a war criminal and yet also have contributed quite a lot to humankind. I'm reminded of Scott Armstrong, the founder of the National Security Archive, sitting next to Robert McNamara on an airplane to Cuba or someplace like that saying, "Bob, you're my favorite war criminal," and led to a wonderful and evocative conversation.
But I think the essential issue is, do we have to think in such binaries?
Right.
Yeah.
And that is, on the one hand, he's a war criminal, and because Jeremy, in my opinion, rightly wants to contest that notion, nonetheless comes out then saying he's a moral man with a strong moral compass. And that doesn't strike me as quite right either. So, I don't know, Jeremy, if you were rewriting those paragraphs of your book again, would you stick to that? And I say that because, I've recently published a book, and there are a few sentences in there which I wish I could change too. That somehow you write them and you don't, and
I think that's fair.
And they're just one sentence out of thousands, and suddenly they loom very large in the way people think about the book. And I'm just wondering if you could rewrite those 2 or 3 sentences, whether you would or would not.
Well, certainly for this moment, I would. If I could change them right now. I think I would, but I would still struggle to find the language to say what I was trying to say, and it's actually, I think, just another way of stating your point, that our very language, even as historians of talking about these things, has become so bifurcated, so polarized, and he doesn't fit either pole to me. He's not. I don't think, unless we're going to use that label much more broadly, I don't think he falls into the war criminal element, and I don't think he is a evil man. But of course, I don't think that he is some upstanding model of morality either. But I think he was operating within what he thought was his moral universe. But that's different, perhaps, from saying he had a moral compass.
Yeah. Of course, as Wojtek Masny has recently pointed out to me with regard to my own book, that even some of the most hideous leaders in the world think within certain, they think they're working within a moral compass themselves. It's just that it's a very distorted one.
Right. No, and I guess, again, this is where I was struggling for the language, and obviously didn't find it maybe sufficiently. But yes, that's true. But his moral compass, though distorted, was not as distorted as the extreme examples we always bring to mind. He's not a Stalin. He's not a Hitler.
That's for sure.
He's not a Milosevic, and he's not
Mao Zedong.
right. I mean, right. I guess I'm going to wait on that one. But I think that's important. And the minute we start throwing war criminal around, we're putting him in the context with Milosevic and the guys in Rwanda and elsewhere, and that to me just does not work. So I'm looking to find something in between that.
Me too.
Any other questions?
No, I haven't finished.
Well, my dissertation was my first book, Power and Protest. That was.
Yes, sir. Yes, he's going to bring you one right now. Thank you.
All right, this is Henry Hetker. I'm a researcher at NARA. I wondered, would you look on Richard Helms as Kissinger's right-hand man in many of his dealings? First, we describe him as a moralist, and then we seem to indicate there's a problem with him being a possible war criminal. How closely did he work with Helms? Is it more so than other secretaries of state?
Well, that's a great question. Well, it's, as you know better than I know, a lot of the CIA documents we don't have access to, so we can't tell for certain. I definitely know he worked closely with Helms, particularly in the case of Chile and elsewhere. But whether he were, and I think he worked more closely with Helms insofar as he was doing more than most secretaries of state. I mean, he had his hands on policy on a daily basis more than Dean Rusk did. But I don't know if that represents, a more nefarious relationship with Helms or a difference in the way the person conducted policy. But there's no doubt that he worked closely with Helms, and that any full account of the Nixon administration will eventually require deep analysis of Helms's activities, and we haven't even scratched the surface. And I don't think Helms's memoir is bad, by the way. I think it's okay. But until we get anywhere near access to some CIA documents, we're going to have to guess on that. I think Helms is a crucial player, certainly.
That's good. There was one more in the back, I believe. Right over here. Yes. And this should be the last question. We've got a couple minutes left. I want to give Mel and Jeremy a chance just to have a final word.
Adrian Steffen. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer and had the dubious pleasure of working under Henry Kissinger and others. And my question has actually been overtaken by some of your comments, but I'm wondering if we confuse being a good human being with being an effective leader. And Cyrus Vance, you mentioned, Warren Christopher, Colin Powell, wonderful man, but ineffective in many ways. And you could make an argument, perhaps, and I'd be interested in your view of that, especially Mr. Loeffler, that Kissinger was managing Nixon, and he did manage him fairly successfully. Powell could not manage George Bush. But he was a much better man.
Well, we would probably need to spend a lot of time first laying out, what should be the criteria that we want to use to judge effective leadership. Kissinger was much more successful at getting certain things done. Some of the things were very good and innovative. Some of the things were very wretched and deplorable. And so and he was successful often at both of those. Mm-hmm.
The one thing I would add is, and this I think relates to your question, I continue to be struck by Kissinger's stamina. And as a historian, I'm more and more struck by it. I mean, we have trouble keeping up with this stuff, and we're not reading it in real time. And take a year like 71 or 72. I mean, he's engaged in detailed negotiations with the North Vietnamese, and whether his approach is flawed or not, he's able to go pretty well detail to detail with them. For the North Vietnamese, that's all that they're really worrying about. For Lee Duc, for him, he's got that. He's managing the SALT discussions. He's managing relations with China. He's managing relations with the Europeans, and he finds a way better than anyone else I've seen to keep those balls in the air. That doesn't mean he doesn't produce bad outcomes, but he keeps those balls in the air in a way in which I'm struck that many of the other people who were mentioned were unable to. And they certainly were unable to play the bureaucratic infighting game as effectively as he was. One other point I just wanted to make, again, just something I've been thinking about, and I think Mel's heard me say this before. I do think one thing we have to look at with Colin Powell that is a similarity with Kissinger is that Powell and Kissinger are both products of patronage. They get to where they are because they're a set of powerful figures who really pluck them out. They're outsiders. I mean, of course, Powell moves through the military, but there's no doubt the Bush family made an effort to promote him. And there's no doubt Nelson Rockefeller did that with Henry Kissinger. I think that one thing we'll look back on with Powell is we'll say he was very reticent to criticize the president.
Condi Rice, too.
And Condi Rice,
Yeah.
because I think she's slightly more complicated. But yeah, I think in both those cases, because of the patronage at work. Remember, Powell criticized Clinton. In fact, when Powell was chairman of JCS, he violated the chain of command by criticizing Kissinger, by criticizing Clinton. But he wouldn't do that for Bush. And I think that has to do with patrons. I think that's part of what goes on with Kissinger. He's got to manage his patron, but he's also he has to constantly show loyalty to his patron. George Marshall didn't have to do that. Dean Acheson didn't have to. Cyrus Vance clearly didn't feel he had to do that. And that's the difference in the nature of those people. I think it's actually a dangerous moment when an outsider becomes an insider. It's good, but it's also dangerous because outsiders often become insiders through personal loyalty, and that can close off some of the kinds of debates that should happen in policymaking.
Let me just leave the final word to Henry Kissinger, who, in the middle of his shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East at an embassy reception, was approached by one of those present who gave him a huge hug and said, "Dr. Kissinger,